بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله حمد الشاكرين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد طب القلوب ودوائها ونور الأبصار وضيائها وعافية الأبدان وشفائها وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد كلما ذكرك الذاكرون وغفل عن ذكرك الغافلون. Today I have arrived to address some of the happenings, events of the past week with regard to the fascists who attempted to disunite this country and who attempted to entice Muslims into violent acts, violations of the law, and have attempted and continue to attempt to incite violence, disunite communities, and disunite our country. But I wanted to address it from the aspect of British values, because some of the far right, extreme far right, and fascists, meaning a different spectrum within the right itself, have attempted to state that the Muslim presence undermines British values. Of course, what are British values has not been defined. Incompetent politicians like Nigel Farage are unable to define what do they actually mean by British values. Nigel Farage recently demonstrated his unprofessionalism by promulgating false rumors with regard to the Southport killer. The Southport killer was not an illegal immigrant, was not a Muslim, and in fact was a Christian born in Wales. He happened to be black, yes, but being black or of any tone of skin does not mean that someone is inherently an evil person or prone to violence. Of course, there was silence across the country amongst the fascists with regard to the arrest and conviction of Hugh Edwards, a BBC journalist for over 40 years who was convicted of hideous crimes, of crimes which are abominable. They were not highlighted by the far right, because what the far right and the fascists, the talk radios of the world, the other talk shows of the world would want the white English people to believe is that there is an inherent problem within colored people, and if not colored people, then specifically Muslims, those who adopt the deen of al-Islam. And what they mention is that al-Islam and Muslims undermine British values, without of course defining what British values are. What are British values? Is it to drink alcohol to the point that a person becomes a drunkard, a person who vomits on the side of the pavement, who breaks public property? Events that we see every other weekend with football fans, some football fans, not all, some football fans, a minority within the football fans also, that give a bad name to football, to the Premier League, to the white working class people, the actual white working class people. Are British values condensed and understood as being promiscuity, immorality, because there is generally a criticism of hijab, which is actually modesty. What are British values? I would like to assert that Islam preserves real British values. And Islam preserves values of all cultures because Islam transcends culture and race. Within this masjid, we have people from various ethnic backgrounds, in the sense that the Indian subcontinent, if you look at the rupee that is printed in India today, some of the rupees, they have over 15 different languages printed on the rupee. Within this room, we have people of various backgrounds and languages. Islam transcends nation states. Islam transcends races. Islam transcends languages. But wherever Islam enters, it does not violate and destroy the culture. That is the propaganda of the Zionists. That is the propaganda of the fascists today, who would want the European people and the British people to believe that Islam is here to destroy culture and to destroy values. But what I would want to affirm and reassert is that Islam preserves real values and real cultures. Islam's historical past of having governed lands far away in the east, Malaysia and Indonesia, all the way to the west tip of Africa, which is modern day Morocco, into Europe, which includes Spain, and the historical epoch of Spanish civilization reaching its ascendancy was during Muslim rule. Islam did not undermine the languages of people. The Ottoman caliphs governed North Africa and the Middle East, yet the Turkish language was not superimposed upon the indigenous peoples of those areas. The clothes that the indigenous people wore were the clothes of their culture, of their history. Islam did not change their clothing. So people should not worry that Islam has come here to superimpose different dress codes upon people. People would not have to discard their dress codes or their languages or their cultures, even if they adopt Islam. Of course, there is the exception of modest dressing, which is the choice of the woman. If there is a woman who makes the choice to dress modestly, that is the choice of the woman. No Muslim in this country is superimposing hijab upon the women. So, currently speaking, within this country and within Europe, there is a fright of illegal immigration. Firstly, we would want to say that illegal immigration is a concern for all British citizens. There should be no illegal immigration. And if the government decides to cap legal immigration, removing those people who have falsely migrated here on a false pretense, on a false pretext, then of course that relates to government policy, and we as Muslims are not opposing any government policy on migration or illegal migration, illegal immigrants. What we are addressing in our mosques, and I utilize the word mosque so people understand that Islam does not pose a threat to civilization. Islam preserves what you refer to as British values. Why do I claim this? Firstly, much has been made with regard to grooming gangs within certain cities. I would want to state with regard to the grooming gangs that they were sentenced, some of them were deported, and the case is closed. So for the fascists to utilize historical grooming gangs in order to validate hooliganism in order to validate violating public property, damaging public property, throwing stones, hurling stones at the police, injuring the police officers, threatening to attack mosques in other cities. That context, that claim of validating this hooliganism under the pretext of grooming gangs is false, because those grooming gangs were jailed. Some of them were, their nationality was taken away from them. And we as the Muslim community approve of punishment by British law against such perpetrators. Some of them in fact believe that we Muslims have a different narrative within our mosques and give a different narrative to the press. That is false. Whatever we state in our mosques, it is exactly what we state to the press. There is consistency with regard to principles of morality, principles of ethics, and the application of law. That if there is any grooming gang, that grooming gang should be punished by the courts, by the civil law system, and those grooming gangs, those perpetrators must be arrested by the police, and our community cooperates with the police against such groomers. Of course, our community transcends ethnicities, because within our community we have people who come from various ethnical backgrounds, people who are classified as being white, indigenous, even though the term is convoluted, the term indigenous in Britain, because Britain has a long history of various ethnicities entering this country and mixing amongst the local population. But we transcend one ethnicity, unlike other religious groups. The closest group to us is the Christian faith. But if we observe the Sikhs, for the most part, they have one ethnicity. If we observe the Hindus, for the most part, they have one ethnicity. We observe the Jews, for the most part, they have one ethnicity. But when we look at Christians and Muslims, we transcend one ethnicity. We have multiple ethnicities within our crowd. So how does Islam actually preserve British values? In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس, addressing the Muslims. And remember, not an ethnic group. It addresses anyone who adopts Islam, which means submission. Yes, it does mean submission, as Lord Pearson, another xenophobe in the House of Lords, claims that Islam means submission and not peace. Yes, it does mean submission, but submission to God. And one of the first British values that British people held was God, King and country. So the first proclamation was for God. So we, Lord Pearson, we do say that Islam is submission to the will of God. That is what it means. Addressing those who submit to the will of God. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Kuntum khayra ummatin. Indeed, you are the best of nations. It's conditional. Why? Ukhrijat linnasi, that have been extracted for humanity, not just for Britain, not just for Africa, not just for Asia and Europe, not just for the Americas, not just for Australasia, but ukhrijat linnasi, you have been extracted for all of humanity. Kuntum khayra ummatin, you are the best of nations, أخرجت للناس, that have been extracted for humanity, تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر, that you command the good and you forbid the evil. What good do we command? That no British citizen should fear a Muslim who has actually submitted to the will of God, to the will of Allah, because that Muslim will not drink alcohol or take drugs. And if there are Muslims who do this, then they are not submitting completely to the will of Allah. That in our community, we have the largest community of teetotalers, people who avoid alcoholic drinks and intoxicants. In terms of percentage, the overwhelming majority of us avoid alcohol and intoxicants. Cannabis is not permitted. Class A drugs are not permitted. We are not permitted to deal with those drugs like the Christians. So the Christians who preserve British values, the Muslims are at the forefront of defending those values which the Christians and the British will claim are the values of being British. So Muslims are at the forefront of preserving British values. Similarly, women in Britain were given their rights only after the suffragette movement. But in Islam, they were given rights when the Quran was revealed. Inheritance, the shares of inheritance were given to women over 1400 years ago. And that code of dress which people now attempt to denigrate, which is hijab. What is the hijab? The hijab is the wearing of an abaya which covers the woman with modesty. It is a dress code which instructs men to respect women. That men must respect women and not objectify women by making them the subject or the making women a sexual object, like the Sun newspaper. Only recently, after the Me Too movement, did the Sun newspaper discard page 3. Prior to that, the Sun newspaper would have nude pictures of women objectifying them for sex. But Islam instructed us to, meaning instructed the Muslim women to wear the dress code of modesty, and instructed the men to lower their gaze and have modesty in front of womankind. It took decades for the Sun newspaper and the sports newspaper and all these different newspapers, trash newspapers, that would objectify womankind. So we Muslims are at the forefront of British values, which is a respect for womankind, not to see women as a sexual object, but to see them for the human being that they are. Similarly, we Muslims are prohibited by Al-Quran Al-Kareem not to approach adultery and fornication. The Quran states, لا تقربوا الزنا إنه كان فاحشة وساء سبيلا. Do not even approach adultery, fornication, for indeed it is what? Immoral, fahisha. وساء سبيلا, a bad way of relieving your desires. So the safeguarding of children and the safeguarding of women and the safeguarding of adults from sexual predators, the Quran gave us guidelines regarding that over 1400 years ago. That we must be strict on the guidelines of Islam to protect people from sexual predators. The Quran already gave us those instructions that do not even approach a zina. So we Muslims are at the forefront of preserving real British values. Unless Nigel Farage has a different idea of what British values are, unless Mr. Robinson, Tommy Robinson, not the drink, the individual Tommy Robinson, has a different idea of what British values actually are. Wiley Holidays now in Cyprus, after taking Zionist money and leading this country to riots and self-destruction, Mr. Robinson is unable to give the correct definition of British values. What are those British values? British values would be not to riot. British values would be not to destroy your own country. British values would be not to throw stones at the police officers, those officers who are working day and night to protect this country. British values would be to preserve the streets that are made and constructed with your tax-paying money. So, British values are protected by Al-Islam. The deen of Al-Islam protects all values. Even in India, it is not Hinduism that will preserve cultural India. It is Islam. Because in India, in Indian culture, drinking alcohol was looked down upon. Amongst Hindus and Sikhs, if someone drank alcohol, they would look down upon that person drinking alcohol. But today, it is only the Muslims that are the largest teetotaler community in the whole of India. Similarly, the glorification of nudity and vice and immorality, the glorification in the media, the glorification in Bollywood movies, the glorification on mass media, it is only Islam which preserves historical Indian culture. So when today we have the rise of the BJP under the leadership of Modi in India, we have the rise of the fascists, reminding one of the black shirts of Mosley from the time of World War II within the UK. We observe that these fascists carry the flag of oppression. Which flag of oppression is that? Today there is a flag that belongs to an illegal entity, an entity that strikes and maims and kills indiscriminately, an entity that was set up from the year 1948 illegally in the land of Palestine, taking away the land of the Palestinians, an entity that they refer to as Israel. That the fascists that are rioting are carrying Israeli flags. Why are right-wing fascists who claim to be British, why are you carrying Israeli flags? Perhaps you want to migrate to Israel, what is known as Israel, which is of course occupied Palestine. If you are actually advocating for the British cause, why are you carrying Israeli flags? If you are advocating for Britain, why are you carrying the flag of Zionists? Why are you carrying the flag of oppression of the IDF within the streets of Britain? Because they ask, why are people carrying the Palestinian flag? They should know that the Palestinian flag was actually drawn up by the British. David Lloyd George the Prime Minister of Britain from 1917, he had a hand in setting up the Palestinian flag without consultation with the Palestinians. So if people are carrying the Palestinian flag, they are in fact carrying a flag that was drawn up and designed by the British in the first place. As for the Israeli flag, it was drawn and designed by the Zionists. So you undermine your own claim. So while the country has potential for disintegration with the current events, you have the likes of Tommy Robinson enjoying his holiday in Cyprus, while real community leaders are actively involving themselves in dissuading our communities not to riot, not to disintegrate, not to resort to violence, and not to exhort any one of the citizens of this country to violence. That is our stance. That we as Muslims, we do not need to wear face masks to cover our identity in any protest if we are not going to commit an illegal act. Defending a masjid, defending a church, defending a gurdwara, defending public buildings, defending any public property from rioters does not require us to wear face masks to cover our identity, because we are not doing anything illegal. Similarly, when we defend our masajid, we do not need to cover our faces, because the fact that we are defending the masajid for the sake of Allah entails that we are not doing anything that we are ashamed of doing. There is no shame in defending those masajid. So recently, the far right or the fascists have placed up rumors from time to time that they will be approaching different areas to carry out different acts of violence. And many times those claims to acts of violence have been false claims. But what it has achieved is that people are riled up, people are then motivated, they are exhumed by zealotry, and they arrive at that point of meeting, and then the far right fascists do not even arrive. They do not enter that area. That is only done to entice young Muslims to resorting to violence, or in an attempt to make some young Muslims, a minority, to make them have clashes with the police. And our message is very clear to all the Muslim community across the UK, that we will not resort to violence, we will not resort to any clashes with the police. We will defend our masajid, we will defend our communities, we will defend other communities also. Not only the Muslim community. Any community that is under danger, we as Muslims will defend those communities. If there is a danger to the Sikhs, we will be at the forefront defending the Sikhs. If there is a danger to the Hindus of this country, we will be at the forefront of defending the Hindus. If there is a danger to the white Englishman, we will defend the white Englishman also. Because our religion does not instruct us to commit acts of oppression against any group. That is a clear message to the fascists or any xenophobic individual who has any one of these, who adopts any one of these ideologies of hate, of xenophobia, of malignant hate, of incendiary abuse. We as Muslims will be at the forefront of justice. So the message is very clear that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس. You indeed are the best nation that has been extracted for people. تأمرون بالمعروف, you command the good and you prohibit the evil. وتنهون عن المنكر, we must live up to that standard. Additionally, many of the non-Muslims who have a hatred for Islam, they are three types. There are those who will never change, irrelevant to what you preach to them or what you propagate to them, or the correct word would be whatever disinformation you attempt to correct, they will always hate Islam and they will despise Muslims. Then there are those who have been misinformed, and then there are those who eventually will adopt Islam. Perhaps there may even be a day when we will see Tommy Robinson adopt Islam. Perhaps. But irrelevant to that, whichever category people may belong to, our task is to give the correct propagation of Islam, to give the correct information regarding Islam, to remove disinformation, and of course to correct our own community from its mistakes also. That many times our a'immatul masajid, imams at the mosques, our community leaders, attempt to correct the mistakes of our own community. Why? Because if we are not the correct ambassadors of Islam, if we are not the correct role models of Islam, people misuse that in order to say that these people who are not the correct ambassadors of Islam are in fact representing Islam, which is false. So in today's day and age, every Muslim has an individual responsibility to avoid anything that contradicts our teachings. And what clearly contradicts our teachings is that we should not imbibe alcohol or intoxicants. We should not be dealing drugs. Muslims should not be involved in prostitution and pimping. Muslims should not be involved in theft and crime. Muslims should be upright citizens of any country that they live in. But this does not undermine the fact that when we stand up for justice, we stand up for the oppressed. And that is what many times the Zionist lobby, those who are influenced by Zionism, they attempt to tarnish those Muslims who stand up against oppression and injustice. That is what happens. When Muslims stand up against oppression and tyranny, the Zionists and others who support them, they attempt to tarnish the correct teachings of Islam and to equate jihad with mindless violence. When in reality jihad is standing up against tyranny. Jihad is standing up against oppression. And that is why Muslims should never fall into the trap of carrying out oppression against people that they may view as associated with the oppressor. I give an example of this many times. That when the Muslims reconquer all of Palestine, the Jewish people will have all their rights within Palestine. And that surprises many people. That when the Muslims retake Jerusalem and the Muslims retake the whole of Palestine, the Jewish people will have two choices. Those who have dual nationality, they can go back to their countries of origin or stay. And if they decide to stay, they simply become citizens under the future caliphate. Yep. Our deen does not instruct us to kill en masse, to burn down properties. If they rightfully belong to people, the Muslim government does not have any right to burn down the properties of any group or to evict people without giving them their complete rights. Of course, in Palestine, those Palestinians who were evicted from 1948 Nakba would have to be returned. The land that belonged to the Palestinians would have to be returned. The homes that belong to Palestinians would have to be returned. But it does not mean Jewish people are under danger, because Islam is not dangerous to anyone in humanity except the oppressor, except the one who carries out acts of tyranny. So there is much propaganda that is done against Islam today. And as I said, the non-Muslims would have to be divided into three categories. There are those who will never believe what we are saying. They will never change their views on Islam. Yet there are those who have been misinformed, and we must remove that misinformation. And there are those who in the future will adopt an Islam. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to better our situation, to enable us to instruct the fascists and the far right what British values actually are. They need to come to the Muslims to learn what are true British values. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم وأتوب إليه.